A woman is watching TV one night when she notices water seeping into her apartment from underneath the door. She calls the superintendent and they follow the trail and discover the source of the leak. When they open the door to the apartment where the water is coming from, to their horror, they see nothing but blood. My name is M. William Phelps. I'm an investigative journalist and the true crime author of dozens of true crime books. I've dedicated the past 25 years of my life to helping families of the missing and murdered. Join me. We're crossing the line. The Pillsbury Avenue South neighborhood in South Minneapolis, Minnesota, is primarily a residential district known for its historic homes and close proximity to local shops, restaurants, and other attractions. Places like the Minneapolis Institute of Art and Eat Street in Powderhorn Park make up part of this community. People here are quiet, and for the most part, they keep to themselves. They help one another and value the historic significance of the area. Back in June 1993, at the 3100 block of Pillsbury, a woman is sitting in her living room inside her apartment, and she looks over toward the front door. She notices that water is trickling in. She gets up, opens the door, and notices right away that the hallway is flooded with water that seems to be coming from one particular apartment up the hallway. So she calls the property management office and explains. Sometime later, the building manager shows up and she points to the door where she thinks the leak is coming from. He walks over and with his master key, he unlocks the apartment. Before the two of them, as they stand there in shock and stare, the inside of the apartment is flooded with water covering most of the floor. Water, that is, mixed with what appears to be blood. The property manager calls his supervisor. The blood, apparently, has placed this situation above his pay grade. A supervisor shows up next, and he walks in through the saturated living room, and he hears the shower running. So he walks into the bathroom and shuts the shower off, not seeing anything out of the ordinary besides water flooding the apartment. From there, he and now a security guard who has joined him begin to walk around the apartment to see if they can find where the source of the blood is coming from. In the bedroom, on the floor, they find a blonde woman in her early 30s, halfway underneath her bed, and she appears to be dead. It seems as if she has been stabbed to death more times than any of them could even consider counting. One investigator will later say, "This was one of the bloodiest, most violent crime scenes I have ever been to." Jeanie Childs, the neighbor who reported the water leak, says, when they ask her the name. Jeanie was tall and slim. She dyed her hair blonde, and her favorite singer, she liked to tell people, was Lionel Richie. One family member later recalls how, as soon as Jeanie heard Lionel Richie's music come on the radio, she'd start dancing. By the time Jeanie was 13, family members said later she was running away from home routinely. Jeanie explained when she was an adult that a male relative had abused her back then, and it destroyed her trust in anybody, and she didn't know how to respond other than just taking off. Jeanie's mother would often head out alone, only her Great Dane beside her, along with a handgun, in search for Jeanie. This went on for years until Jeannie's mother discovered that Jeanie was using drugs and making ends meet any way she could. We've all heard this story before. There did come a point where Jeanie cleaned up, got married, but then divorced. She even married a second time and became a stepmother, but the beck and call of using drugs had never subsided, and she soon found herself back in that spiral. We've all heard that story, too, before. You know, I can't go on here without saying something. It only takes one scumbag male in a family to ruin some young girl's life. That's what I mean by we've heard this story before. Not the story of someone being abused and then growing up to use drugs. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the piece of garbage who destroys somebody's life and walks away as if just another day. At the time her body is discovered in 1993, Jeanie is living with a man, Arthur Gray, a man police reports claim Jeanie worked for on the street. Gray cut a large figure, skying over Jeanie by a foot at least, with about 100 pounds on her. He was said to be an angry dude and had put Jeanie, in his words, in her place many times, which again, police reports back up. So when investigators arrive on the scene and they find out who Jeanie is, and more importantly, that she lives with Gray, a man they know, 2 + 2 makes 4, man. They immediately surmise Gray had something to do with what went on in that apartment. He seems like the ideal suspect. Jeanie pissed him off one last time, and he snapped. Soon they discover that in one of Jeannie's hands is a hair matching Arthur, and it appears the paperwork for the case will be a lot less cumbersome having found their guy so quickly. Boy, that's a good day when you feel like, wow, we got this major murder case here, and within hours you have a suspect. And then within a day, you're finding evidence to back it up. But as detectives begin looking for Gray, they cannot find him. They ask around. Gray is an avid biker with the bandana tied around his head, the big fat Harley Davidson, the jeans and white t-shirts, tattoos, biker boots, and big stomach. And as they talk to people who know Gray, they soon find out that he is not even in town and hasn't been in several days. A quick check of his alibi leads them to finding out that Gray is actually in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, on a bike trip with some friends, many of whom can back it all up. After the water subsides in Jeannie's apartment and her body is taken to the medical examiner's office, investigators discover several footprints in blood and now mold that's on the floor in the kitchen, and they do not match with Jeannie's bare feet. They then speak to a witness who says she saw Jeanie on that day they now know she was murdered, walking into the building with a very tall man who had blonde hair, and he was wearing a trench coat. This is about all they get for a description from this witness. And apologies for the brutality of this next part, but it is important in understanding this case. As the autopsy begins, the coroner finds a remarkable amount of wounds and punctures in Jeannie's body. 17 superficial cuts had been made to her abdomen, and one very long and large cut along her gut, exposing her intestines. 7 additional stab wounds were located on her neck, and more on her chest, back, arms, hands, and buttocks. A number of these, the coroner tells investigators, were inflicted post-mortem. Her killer had attacked Jeanie in a frenzied state of violence, stabbing her dozens of times, but then he took his time after she was dead to place slices, we could call them, all over her body. Almost as if there was some sort of ritualistic nature behind the murder. There was blood all over Jeannie's bedroom, in the hall, inside the bathroom, all over her bed, and along the walls. If we are speculating, picture Jeanie realizing what's happening and running, her attacker behind her, stabbing at her repeatedly and aggressively as he chases her. A horror show, incredibly violent. Of course, he turns the shower on, plugs up the bathtub to try to hide evidence, to try to wash the apartment of any evidence, maybe. Back at the crime scene, they begin collecting DNA. We are at a time, 1993, when DNA is now a thing, and police departments are all about sifting through scenes carefully to collect as much DNA as possible, knowing now that if it doesn't help the investigation in the short term, the potential to help catch a killer down the road is growing exponentially. Inside the apartment, they recovered DNA from the comforter on Jeanie's bed, a blue towel inside the bathroom, a washcloth they find on top of the toilet seat, a red shirt found on the toilet seat near the cloth, and a scraping of a blood stain from the bathroom sink. Plenty of DNA here. There can be no doubt, with such violence involved, that they have the killer's DNA, which is a great start, of course, but DNA from a crime scene in 1993 is only as good as something to compare it to. If they place that DNA in the early version of a countrywide database to see if there's a match and nothing comes out of it, it's the end of the line at that time for that line of inquiry. You'd have to develop suspects and begin testing them, or be patient and wait. The trench coat blonde guy lead is a dead end. They cannot identify the guy at all. He could be anybody, he could be everybody. That DNA they collect in abundance leads nowhere. 1993 becomes 2003, which becomes 2013. And it's not until 2015 that Jeanie's case even becomes a case the Minneapolis PD begin to think about again. Not because they do not care or they abandon the investigation, but it just stalled on them. There was nowhere to go, so they waited. Yet by 2015, with all the advancements made in DNA and forensic genealogy leading the way to discovering unknown suspects, the department decides to reopen the case and begin to dig deep to see if they can come up with anything. They focus on the DNA specifically found in the apartment complex stairwell outside of Jeanie's apartment next to a sample of her blood. The theory is that her killer ran out of the apartment and unknowingly smeared his own blood along with hers on that stairwell. So they run it, and boom, they get a hit to a guy who is, as luck would have it, in prison on violating his probation and a DUI. So they head over to the jail to talk to the guy. Seems like a good place to take a quick break. Remember to check out the new season of my iHeartMedia Investigative podcast, limited series, Paper Ghosts, The Texas Teen Murders, which just launched, and you can get wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Be back with more Crossing the Line with M. William Phelps in one moment. When a killer snaps, loses control, and allows his dark volcanic rage to take over, I think you have him. As a killer enters into his frenzy of violence, he is not thinking about getting away with the crime, only that he has to feed his rage and satisfy his demons. Afterward, as we have seen in many, many cases, he only then begins to panic and try to clean up after himself. If he goes that route, well, you've got him. There is no way in today's day and age of touch DNA, a killer can get rid of everything. Impossible. Back when Jeannie's case broke in 1993, DNA, of course, was in its infancy and just beginning to be used as a tool to catch killers. As 2015 came around and they reopened the case and retested a lot of the DNA, advancements in forensic technology had come so far, it was almost a given that if you had unknown DNA from a crime scene, you had a solid chance of identifying your killer, especially knowing that criminals cannot stay out of trouble. When they approached the latest suspect in 2015, a guy named John Eswine, he comes across rather humble and surprised. "My blood was in that building?" he asks investigators, very surprised. "We did find your blood in that building," they proclaim. I should note, finding his blood along a stairwell, even though it was located next to Jeannie's blood, is a long shot. A good defense attorney would rip that evidence to shreds simply because there are so many anomalies and situations which could have taken place. You'd have to have a lot more to nail this guy. "If you found my blood somewhere," Eswine says, who had waived his rights and had no trouble speaking to investigators, "all I can think of is that I must have fallen down somewhere." He claims he hadn't been inside that building since 1991, and it was only once. They ask him if they can take footprints from him to match up to what they found inside the apartment. "No problem," he says. "How about your DNA?" they ask. "Absolutely." Both of those tests do not amount to anything. Eswine's DNA was never uncovered inside Jeannie's apartment, which we have established, I think, would have to be impossible considering the violent nature of the murder. There's just no way her killer could have cleaned up all his DNA inside that apartment. As forensic scientists begin to retest and study all of the DNA from the crime scene, after it was determined that Eswine is probably not their guy, a common denominator turns up that hadn't been discovered until now. One particular DNA profile was found throughout the apartment. The same donor. On the t-shirt, the blue towel, the washcloth, and the comforter. It seems that this would be the profile of your killer. How could a random guy, maybe someone just visiting Jeannie, leave his DNA all over those items associated with her murder? But then, where do you go with this latest discovery? How do you find out who that donor is? Forensic genetic genealogy. Where else? You begin to build a family tree within the online databases and hope for the best. It doesn't take too long in relation to how long some of this research can actually take. By 2018, they have two names, one of whom is a 52-year-old married father of 3 kids, seemingly living a carefree, crime-free life. They begin looking at the man, Jerry Westrom. He lived in North Minneapolis, St. Paul, back then and worked for a company in St. Cloud. He grew up in a rural farming area of the state and has a Facebook account and seems not to be hiding from anyone. Jerry has jet black hair, curly and shortly cropped, a receding hairline, a chubby baby face, dark brown eyes. He's a businessman, and his family actually owns a Sears at the time, along with a gas station and a convenience store. When those businesses felt the hit of a slow economy, Jerry bounced back to then begin raising organic soybean and corn, and even starts to sell crop insurance. Self-made man, I guess. More importantly, though, Jerry has zero history of any violent crime. And so investigators are a little taken aback by this. How can someone, even though he was in his 20s, stab a woman over 60 times in what feels like a ritualistic murder and then not have any sort of violent history before or after? What's more, Jerry is devoted to his children and their sports teams. He travels with the kids to participate in hockey tournaments. He is that dad involved on the sidelines cheering on the team. Investigators need to confirm their tests with a sample of DNA from Jerry, and they do not want to approach him, just in case he says no, or they don't want to tip him off that he's being investigated. So 2 agents follow him to a hockey game in Wisconsin. They follow him around the arena. He has no clue the FBI is at the game, scoping him out, waiting for him to blow his nose or leave a drinking cup on a table. At one point, Jerry sits at a table and eats and drinks. He finishes and then wipes his mouth with a napkin and tosses everything in the trash afterward. One of the agents stands next to the garbage and waits. When everyone is gone, they go in and grab the napkin. They now have his DNA. Within a few days, they test that napkin with DNA taken from the blue towel they found inside the bathroom. The comment law enforcement later gives is this: they were consistent with each other. Generally, we hear they were an identical match of 99.9%. So that tells you something, I think. In any event, Jerry is charged and arrested. The hockey dad now considered a violent murder suspect. Just like that, overnight, this guy's life changes. They question Jerry, and he denies ever knowing Jeanie. There is no way he had sex with her. Within what is a fairly brief interview, 11 minutes exactly, before Jerry asks to speak with an attorney, what investigators really focus on after the interview is what Jerry didn't say. And we know that those bells a suspect doesn't ring can be as important as those he does ring. Jerry never asks investigators what happened, why he is there and has been arrested, and what evidence has drawn them to him after almost 30 years. Looking at his record, investigators focus on a few things. 2 arrests for soliciting sex workers way back in Jerry's past. That's a red flag for them, knowing that Jeanie had worked as a sex worker at the time of her murder. What's even more suspicious is that Jerry grew up in Isanti, Minnesota, the same town where Jeanie and her sisters grew up. As it turns out, as well, they also find Jerry's DNA in the form of semen on the comforter from Jeanie's bedroom where her body was found. The guy was inside her apartment. No doubt about it. That all said, reports show that there was also additional DNA, not Jerry's, found on Jeanie's panties. And that DNA from the stairwell connected to suspect John Eswine raises some concerns if you are looking to prosecute Jerry for Jeanie's murder, right? Because Jerry's attorneys are going to say, well, John Eswine's DNA is found next to her blood on the stairwell. And then there's 2-3 other donors in her bedroom. You better have more than that. So you have a guy saying he was there in the apartment complex, Eswine, and a guy who says he was never there, Jerry. 2 big issues for prosecutors. Jerry has a big problem in telling the police he wasn't there, but then they find his DNA on her comforter. Moreover, there were also other DNA donors, all males, found on that same comforter. One guy they identify had committed several violent sex crimes in his life. And that guy, James Luther Carlton, is tied to a murder eerily similar to Jeanie's in Minneapolis a year after Jeanie was killed. And how do they tie Carlton to that other murder? Bloody footprints he left at the scene. This case is very problematic for investigators and prosecutors looking to bring Jerry into court to face trial. But they are confident, considering that one of their experts also matches Jerry's footprints to those found inside Jeannie's apartment. But all considering, couldn't Jerry just have been a customer of Jeannie's? Let's take one final break and come back and sort it all out. There are twists coming, I promise you that. More Crossing the Line with M. William Phelps in 1 minute. During the summer of 2022, Jerry Westrom sits inside a Minnesota courtroom facing the fight of his life, with his wife and 3 children sitting behind him supporting the guy. Reports also show Jerry and his wife holding hands as they walk in and out of court. A lot of evidence was excluded by the judge, which would have ultimately helped Jerry's team defend him and raise questions about other suspects, which I understand and then I don't understand. Why not allow it all to an extent in order to avoid appellate issues and also give the jury a clear and entire picture? So as it turns out for the jury, it seems as though Jerry was the only suspect. But then all the prosecution had was his DNA, semen, and a footprint. Hardly enough to prove murder, I would think. On the other hand, when a jury has no other alternative narrative to consider, they can only look at what is in front of them. Remember, Arthur Gray's hair was found in Jeannie's hand, the guy who was said to be in charge of Jeannie. He also had domestic violence charges against him for domestic abuse with regard to Jeannie. And then there was the blood on the stairwell, a blonde guy in a trench coat. None of this was offered at trial. After 8 days of testimony, with Jerry refusing to testify, the jury comes back and convicts him. Murder in the first degree. They find him guilty of murder in the second degree as well. A month later, he is sentenced to life in prison. Jeannie's family is satisfied the right man is serving time for Jeannie's murder. This is a tough one. With the evidence presented at trial, I would question all of it, but in the end likely vote guilty based on what was in front of me. Then again, I have doubts now. So if I had doubts in a jury room, I would have to vote not guilty. A year after Jerry's conviction, the Minnesota Supreme Court vacated Jerry's second-degree murder conviction based on what it says is a violation of a Minnesota statute. But his first-degree murder conviction stands. Jerry petitioned the Supreme Court of the United States to hear his first-degree murder conviction, but they denied him. At Jerry's sentencing, Jeannie's mother, in tears, recalled for the court the last conversation she had with her daughter. "I've waited so many years to have this end, and it's put my life through so much hell," she says. Outside the court, she tells CBS News, "I know that the law is finally going to take care of him for what he did, and I hope he can sleep at night." So she's convinced they got the right guy. Jeannie's sister mentioned Jeannie's troubles and talked about how she did not deserve to die like she did, adding she was still a human being and she did not deserve to be slaughtered like an animal. I feel that law enforcement in this case worked very hard for a long time, did their jobs well, never gave up, and most important, followed the evidence. Once they gathered all of that evidence and believed they had a solid suspect, they handed it over to the prosecutors, who took it from there and built their own case. And prosecutors believe, without a doubt, they got a conviction based on facts and that the right man is serving time for Jeannie's murder. That's it for this week. Be safe. Be aware. Sources for this episode include State of Minnesota versus Jerry Arnold Westrom, Order of Detention, Complaint, and Affidavit. Various CBS News reports of Jerry Westrom's trial. Jeanie Child's obituary. Crossing the Line is executive produced by M. William Phelps, LLC, and Matthew Valentinus, Mom's Basement Management. Written by me, M. William Phelps. Audio mastering and mixing by Matt Russell. Music by Epidemic Sound. Original music written and performed by Thomas Mooney, Tom Phelps, and Matt Russell.